Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to another edition of the Humanities Forum. Glad you could all be here today. As you might know by now, we meet almost every Friday during the semester to listen to the insights, the research, the work of scholars and journalists from around the country and around the world. It's an opportunity for the Providence College community to come together, to deepen our appreciation of the humanities, to ask difficult questions, to entertain new ideas. And it's an opportunity for you to pursue, the big ideas outside of the classroom. So thank you for being here. Let me tell you a tiny bit about what to expect, and then I'm going to hand the mic over. So it's 3:30 now. You can expect things to wrap up probably around 4:45 or so. And what happens is we'll have a talk, and then after the talk, there's a Q&A. And you should know, if you're an undergraduate here, that you have to ask the first question. Not all of you, but one of you has to. Like, you don't just sit there and wait for your professors to talk. Student asks the first question. So get ready, be on your toes. The other things that I should announce or remind you of, one is after the talk, there's a reception just down the hall in the great room where you can socialize, continue the conversation, etc. And we would ask you, in order to pay full attention to what's happening here, to please power down those laptops as if you're, taking off in an airplane. That's right, they'll be there in a minute. Today's event is sponsored by several organizations in collaboration with the Humanities program. One of them is the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange. Another is the Department of History and Classics. And the third is the Gladys Brooks Foundation. So we're very thankful for our co-sponsors in this event. I'm going to turn the mic over now to Dr. Lutzi, who will be introducing our speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I'm glad to see so many people are here on a gray Friday afternoon, before the black and white ball. So kudos to you for showing up. So I'm very excited to introduce you today, Dr. Ari Yoskovitz, who is the chair of Jewish Studies and the associate professor of Jewish Studies and European Studies and an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University. This feels very loud, sorry. He is a historian who is especially interested in the interplay between Jewish history and transnational minority politics since the Enlightenment. His first book, The Modernity of Others, Jewish Anti-Catholicism in Germany and France, explores how German and French Jews in the long 19th century defined their own modernity and national belonging by criticizing the anti-modern politics of the Catholic Church. His most recent book, I meant to grab it. His most recent book is Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, and it traces, as you'll hear more about, the entanglement of the histories of Jews and Romanis throughout the 20th century, focusing on Western and Central Europe, as well as the US and Israel. Those of you who have had me in DWC 201 will note that he has a shout out to Michel Rolfe-Trio in the introduction. And so those of you who have been through 201 know how excited I get to talk about Michel Rolfe-Trio and the construction of history. So that's one of the main focuses of this book, and I think he does a brilliant job of bringing to light many of the silences in the history of the Holocaust in this book. His work has been featured in the New York Times, and I am very pleased to introduce him today, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much for the invitations. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I want to talk today, about Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, and I'm doing that with some larger questions in mind. One of them is how we learn about the suffering of others, in particular when it concerns groups about whom we know very little, and what our responsibilities are towards these others. Now, when you see the title here, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, you see two groups brought together by one event. And of these three terms, I would say, there's much to learn about each of them, but it is the word Roma that usually raises most questions for most people. they are the group, indeed, we know very little about, as a rule. So let me first say something about Roma, just to introduce you to the group. It's the name given to approximately 10 to 12 million people who call themselves by that name, who used to be called gypsies in many contexts. They are an incredibly diverse group that includes a diversity of religion. They very often have the religion of their neighbors. Catholic, more often Catholic, in fact, than Protestant, but also Orthodox Christians, Muslims. They are indeed sometimes itinerant, and that is, I think, the image that has stuck with us. If you think of the word gypsies, I think many people think of people traveling in some form or traveling in wagons. That is not how most Roma live, and certainly also not how most Roma would have lived by the time of the Holocaust, especially the further you go east from, say, Central Europe. More Roma were settled and started to be forcibly settled in part since the 18th century, and by the 20th century, the vast majority had lived in a settled life. Finally, the language. There is a language called Romani. It is a language that many groups can speak, that is sort of central for the Romani identity, even though not every single Romani person will speak it. Many groups also historically stopped speaking it. For example, in Spain, gitanos, who do not speak it. And there are some shared traditions, shared sense of ethnicity sometimes, and at the same time, many of the Romani subgroups will also have a very clear understanding of their distinctiveness, and for example, will frown upon, traditionalists will frown upon people intermarrying with other Romani groups. All this diversity also leads to a diversity of terms, so I won't bother you with many terms. Roma is the first one. There is another term. There are many other terms for their self-description, various groups. British groups sometimes are called Romani Shell. The other group that I want to introduce you to are so-called Sinti. Those are the groups that live mostly in German lands. And those are essential for our story also because the Holocaust starts in Germany. So these groups will call themselves Sinti and will say, no, Roma are the Eastern European brothers and sisters. So in Germany, people didn't generally say Sinti and Roma. And in Austria, where I'm from, people say Roma and Sinti because they're more Roma than Sinti. So I will use the word Sinti sometimes as well. They are, by most counts, Europe's largest ethnic minority. And nevertheless, I would assume that most of you will have not encountered them in textbooks, history courses. If you travel, you will not have encountered them in national museums. So what is unknown about them is not just largely what happened to them during the Holocaust, but indeed the fact that we don't know much about how they were murdered is a reflection of the fact that they are generally not part of how we imagine history. My own path to understanding that history, to thinking about that history that we usually don't tell, comes through the lens of Jewish history. And there are various personal and academic reasons for that. I was trained in Jewish history originally before coming to this topic, but, and that's what I want to show you in this talk, there are many, perhaps expected and many unexpected connections between these two groups. So to illustrate that, to tell you about these connections, let me first bring you to a location where the Romani genocide is commemorated. Right? I spoke a lot about how it is hidden. There are places where it is commemorated. One of those places is the first permanent exhibition on the Romani genocide and Romani history. And that is a place in the German city of Heidelberg, where the German Association of Sinti and Roma created a museum. And if you enter that museum, there's school classes going through them, some tourists go there, and you enter that museum, what you will see is this sentence. It will say, the genocide against the Sinti and Roma was executed with the same motive of racial hatred, with the same intention, and the same will to systematically and definitively exterminate as the genocide against the Jews. The very same statement would welcome you if you went to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is a museum now, right? It's a memorial site. There are different barracks commemorate different groups' fate. The pavilion commemorating the murder of Roma also has this. There's a central monument in Berlin for the murder of the Sinti and Roma, as it's called there. And there was a discussion if this should be the inscription, a sentence by the German president. Eventually, a different one was chosen. What you see here is very quickly how the Jewish and the Romani genocide are connected. And we can see this, obviously. We can see the dependence here very quickly if we just try to imagine for a second the inverse, right? If you were to enter, say, well, the biggest Holocaust museum in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., you would obviously never be welcomed with a sentence that says, well, don't forget, just to explain that Jews were murdered with the same motive, will, etc., as the Roma. It would make no sense. Nor could you imagine it on a monument. There's a central monument in Berlin for the murder of the European Jews. You couldn't imagine the same inverse sentence there. That is because one is better known and the other one is not. And what you can see here is the dependence when you communicate about that genocide. It's dependent on that other genocide. This is also true when it comes to just knowledge production. Say you were interested in the Holocaust, you're a scholar, you're a student. You want to hear the voices of victims. What would you do? Well, you would look at one of the testimony archives that exist out there. The biggest one that exists is the USC Visual History Archive, or Shoah Foundation Archive, founded in the 1990s. It has over 50,000 interviews with Jewish survivors. It also has 406 interviews with Roma and Sinti. Now, there are different ways of seeing that now, right? Is that a lot? Is it little? Well, it's a very small part of that larger archive. You can see it's a bit of an afterthought. But that afterthought makes it the biggest archive of Romani testimonies in the world. So what you can see here is, you care about Romani history, you want to hear their voices, you have to go to an archive dedicated to commemorating the Jewish genocide. So how do we deal with it when two minorities are connected in this way? How do we think about that connection? And I think one thing that happens very often when we think in those terms, when we think about, when we realize there's a connection there, is that we start to compare. And comparisons have a reason. This is how we make sense of the world. We compare. Humans live in social groups. They compare. The victims compared themselves, in fact, to each other permanently. And at the same time, comparisons between genocides, between these genocides, and between genocides in general, have a problem. Now, why? What is the problem with comparing? Well, first, they tend to create hierarchies of suffering. If I just tell you that 6 million Jews died, estimates for the murder, overall death count of Roma and Sinti vary widely, somewhere between 120,000 and 500,000. There is already, I think, it creates a strange, it sounds like an empirical statement, but there is still a hierarchy that is created by it. Let me explain why. This brings me to the second point, really, at the same time. These types of empirical statements about comparisons, there's no real empirical way of deciding which types of juxtapositions make more sense. So my example, is the state where I grew up, Austria. Now, one way of speaking about casualties of the Nazi genocides in Austria is to tell you that approximately 64,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis and 9,000 Roma. So that would fit the numbers you just heard also of the overall count. But if I tell you percentages, it would be that 30% of Jews were murdered, but 80% of the Romani population did not survive. Is one or the other the more accurate count? No, there is no way of deciding. But much more than that. I think once you hear me go through this, I don't know if some of you have this as well, it sounds deeply uncomfortable to do these types of number games. If I just imagine telling what I just told you to my grandparents who were Holocaust survivors, Jewish Holocaust survivors, they would look at me like I'm crazy, like, who cares? What are you trying to prove? Ultimately, these types of number games very often feel to survivors for good reasons, like we are ultimately downplaying their suffering, actually, which tells you why many Romani groups are very sensitive precisely about these numbers. So one problem with comparisons is indeed that it seems like we're just doing empirical work, but there is always much more involved in it. Also, how do we decide in reality? So if there's no, if you want, objective way of deciding which juxtapositions are the right ones, well, there's a history to it. Here is me as a historian speaking. If I look at the way people have compared, I can see who started comparisons, for example. Those are courts. Why did courts need to decide about the genocide and what is worse and what is not? Well, compensation payments. Once they understood, once there was, a clear precedent for paying compensation to Jews, German courts had to decide if they will give the same payments to Roma. And that's exactly when they started to have very rigid checklists about how we want to compare. And that's when they decided, nope, it's not the same. Withholding payments to Roma. So very often these comparisons ultimately do have consequences. And the history of these comparisons is precisely that they create a hierarchy of suffering, very often with a purpose. Okay, so I told you what not to do. Clearly, we're here for longer. Comparison is not what we're supposed to do. What are we supposed to do with these two groups? Well, my suggestion is we don't compare as much as we talk about relationships. What we do is we try to understand how both of these groups actually related to each other. And when we do that, we don't just realize that several elements of their fate is entwined, but really that the way we record their history, think about their history, is connected as well. It helps us understand and reframe even how we compare their fates. Okay, so let me then take you back. Let me take you to the beginning. And the beginning, as far as I'm concerned, there are many beginnings, two groups that live for how many centuries and longer in Europe. The beginning, for my purposes, is the Nazi era, because that's when the particular narrative of suffering next to each other really starts. So if you were to think of the early years of the Nazi regime, 1933, when the Nazis come to power, to 1939. So that would be the beginning of World War II. These 6 years are when Nazi Germany is basically a regime in one country that is expanding already, I should add, but that is not yet in a world war. If you just look at these years, you would not know from the statements of victims that they are suffering next to each other. So our understanding is, right, we list them as victims together. That was not necessarily their perception at the time. For example, if you read Jewish newspapers at the time, and of course the ones in Nazi Germany are censored, the ones outside Nazi Germany are not censored, at least not when it comes to these persecution measures. If you were to read these newspapers, you would not know that the interment of Roma really starts the interment of ethnicized groups, of racialized groups, before Jews are interned. 1935, the city of Cologne starts a so-called a municipal camp, a gypsy camp, outside on the periphery of its municipality. By 1936, in the shadow of the Berlin Olympics, many other cities would follow: Berlin, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, Essen, Dortmund, Gelsenkirchen, various other municipalities. And these camps will be part of, ultimately, of a larger system which allows them to be highly policed, and from there, many will be deported eventually to concentration camps or extermination camps further east. If Jews actually even noticed that, German Jews noticed that, they probably perceived them much like the other Europeans did. These measures were for them probably just extensions of things that had been going on for a much longer time. It's the sort of thing they probably thought welfare authorities, police authorities were doing with people who seem unwanted. So arresting so-called gypsies as vagabonds might have just seemed like business as usual, whereas boycotting Jewish stores was much more clearly marked, purposefully marked as a revolutionary act. There was also very little reason why German Jews should think that they would end up in a so-called gypsy camp. They were right. They wouldn't. They would eventually they would end up in the same camps in other places, but through a different trajectory. The result of all of this is also that if we look at early histories of the Holocaust and subsequent histories of the Holocaust, these camps would not show up. Some of the earliest histories were written by survivors. Some of the people who were not survivors, who wanted to understand these stories, used the documentation created by the survivors to write their histories. So as a result, what you can see is the perceptions of the time meant that they are not in the history books, and that means they're not in our chronologies. If you go to a chronology of the Holocaust, if you go to a chronology of Nazi persecutions, these camps will very likely not show up. Ultimately, it also shows us that it's a bit hard to just look at victim voices to answer difficult questions. I think we have a tendency to think, the Nazis obviously, the traces they leave us, they're problematic. It's the perpetrators, and this is the way they see people they're dehumanizing. But the victims, obviously, this is the voice that we want to elevate. But there's not just one victim voice, there are multiple different victim voices. What we can see here is that we don't solve all our problems by listening to victims. We need, or by the victim. Rather, victims exist in a plurality. It's especially important when we think of those victims whose marginalization is so profound that we don't even register that it's happening, which is precisely the case with Roma. Now, all of this did transform with the war, and between 1939 and 1945, if you want this, the period of the radicalizing policies when also eventually mass genocide would happen. It's in that context that really Jews and Roma start to interact with each other much less as tropes, as symbols for something, and much more as real victims who are interacting with each other as embodied people. The Nazis do try to separate the persecution of different groups, but they're never really fully successful. One place where these types of interactions, I think, become very visible would be Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the famous camp with its gas chambers as well. There is a sub-camp there. People are not in one big camp, but Auschwitz-Birkenau has various sub-camps. There's one called B2E, so-called Gypsy Camp. This camp for Roma and Sinti is right next to the ramp, which, starting in May 1944, is a famous ramp where Jews would be selected, as the Nazis would put it, and people would be moved from there to the gas chambers. So Roma and Sinti would be some of the last victims, some of the last non-perpetrators who would see these Jews alive. To some degree, there is a visual aspect to this. Not all of the testimony we have is visual. A lot of the testimony is actually auditory. This is true, for example, for a ghetto, the Lodz ghetto, one of the second largest ghetto in Poland, second largest ghetto in Europe for Jews. There you also had, for a short period, 5,000 Austrian Roma who were deported to a separate ghetto carved out of the ghetto. And Jews did not interact. Most Jews did not interact with them because they're sort of separated by barbed wire fence, except for some Jewish doctors and some others. Most Jews remember, what they remember from this camp are screams. Screams they cannot interpret. The same is true for Jewish testimonies of the night of August 2nd, 1944, which is the night when over 4,000 Roma and Sinti, everybody who was left in that camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau, was murdered in a single night. For many Jewish survivors, according to them, they described it as the worst night of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the memory, because there were nothing to be seen, it was, they had to stay in their blocks, they had to, it was night. The memory is a memory of sounds. And then there are other interactions too. Some of these very, very indelible memories are about tactile interactions, burying each other's dead or dealing with the property of the other group that has been exterminated. There's a paradox, however, that emerges here if we look at the testimonies. These types of interactions, which did leave such a deep mark and often led to expressions of solidarity, did not necessarily lead to a deeper understanding of the other group. Why? Well, you can remember what I said about the screams. They're not about the living people. They didn't, seeing people being murdered at a distance, hearing their suffering, doesn't mean you know how they lived. You don't know anybody's name. There is an element of solidarity there, but not necessarily of understanding. The people who did interact with each other had very often more ambiguous relationships. Some of them created friendships, but in many other cases, these interactions were the results of the Nazis forcing one group to oversee another group, to police another group. The most famous of these stories is when Jews from northern Transylvania, which was Romania, became Hungary. They were deported from there to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And for 2 weeks, these Jews were in the so-called gypsy camp, and German Sinti were their capos, or overseers. And many of these survivors had memories of abuse by these overseers. And the most famous person to have these types of memories is Elie Wiesel. This is actually one of the key turning points in his famous night. My father suddenly had a colic attack. He got up and asked politely in German, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the toilets are located?" The gypsy stared at him for a long time from head to toe, as if he wished to ascertain that the person addressing him was actually a creature of flesh and bone, a human being with a body and a belly. Then, as if waking from a sleep, he slapped my father with such force that he fell down. And he then describes how he stood petrified and had not been able to act. It's a turning point for the narrative, basically. It's whether it's also an experiential one is a separate question. It's definitely a narrative turning point where he understands that he's helpless in the camps. I added the Yiddish here because it's actually very different. The original was in Yiddish, but it also includes this scene and several other instances where he's actually where he speaks of Roma. So it's these moments, and sometimes simply the mere fact of famous people being deported, or people who eventually would become famous being deported, that changes perceptions. I should say it's less typical actually that Roma would oversee Jews than the other way around, for the simple fact that most Roma would be deported to spaces that were originally built to persecute Jews. So neither of these people have a choice, right? Roma would, for example, actually build the ramp where Jews would be selected, not their choice, but they live in a camp built by that Jews were forced to build. So these interactions are forced on them by the Nazis, But they create precisely this paradoxical relationship where knowledge does not exactly match, where there's an inverse relationship between how close the relationship is and how much and how you express the solidarity. So that's the first thing I think that we can learn looking at these testimonies. The second thing that we can learn here is that if we want to understand any of this, any of what I just told you, what we didn't need was to go to what did Berlin order? How did Berlin think about the two groups, right? This sort of comparative move. Actually, if we want to understand how these two groups are interacting, it's all about local decisions, what is pragmatic for the Nazis, and how people remember. It has not much to do with how the Nazis determined they were thinking about each group. And then the third thing that we can get out of this is that, well, most Roma and Sinti and Jews actually suffered next to each other, but not with each other. What would bring them together is not so much what happened to them during the Holocaust in terms of shared experiences. What would bring them together would be the attempt to rectify what happened. It's the documentation effort and the attempt to seek justice. And that's where I want to bring you next. And to do that, I want to introduce you to a document. To a document that I found fascinating and puzzling. This document is here. You can see it in the Jewish community of Vienna in its archive. It's part of a whole slew of similar lists. They have lists of Jews who received support from the U.S. government, from U.S. aid organizations. They have lists of Jews who spent Viennese Jews who spent between 3 and 3.5 years in a concentration camp and returned. It's a list right next to this one, which, again, I found interesting because it has my grandmother on it. This is the list right next to it. All the lists there, as you might expect, from the Jewish Community Archives are about Jews, except for this one. This one list, created actually by an organization that was founded by the Jewish community, called the Action Committee. It's called the List of Gypsies Registered with Us. And it lists 33 Romani men and women, and for privacy reasons I blurred some of them. They were generally from two larger families, Gusak and Horvat. And they were brought together by two people, and I'll just tell you a bit about these two people to give you a sense of the types of people who were on this list. The two oldest people the two people who brought these families together, who were a couple, were Adolf Husak, or Gusak, and Hermine Horvat. They both had lost everything in the camps. Gusak lost his first wife. Horvat lost her parents and 4 siblings in the camp. Neither of them had anything to return to. Gusak had nothing to begin with. He was an orphan and had been raised by a priest. Never owned anything. Horvat's family did own a very small house with a vineyard, which was taken by their neighbors and simply not returned after the war. There was a whole historians' commission on these types of expropriations, and actually that is completely standard. Basically, nobody received anything back. None of the Roma received anything back. In the summer of 1946, the members of these two families ended up going to Vienna, actually, from the countryside, and registering with an association that had been formed by the Jewish community. And what would happen is that this Jewish community organization would check their information and would certify that they are victims. And then it would be sent to a central organization that would also check this, and that was run by political prisoners. And they would very often then reject these claims. Why? Because for a lot of the other victims of Nazism, there was a sense that they want to be seen as pure victims, and that being close to people who are called vagrants, criminals, asocials, that would be, put them in disrepute. So there was a tendency to distance themselves from them. Jewish community here was an exception. It was one of the places where they could get certified. And to some degree, there were also real overlapping experiences. They were both, when they were liberated, the first thing people would do, both Jews and Roma would do, is try to find surviving relatives. They would also have a shared experience of returning home and not being welcome. Neither anti-Semitism had disappeared, nor anti-Romani sentiment. Basically, people felt they themselves were victims. Non-Jews, non-Roma felt they themselves were victims of a war. And now these people are coming back from the camps. Unfortunately, what do they want from us? But there were also differences between the two groups. These differences play into this as well. Yes, Jews like Roma could use their family networks to solve their basic, to help them find relatives, to build up a life again. But Jewish groups could also rely on a much longer history of aid organizations that would help them. The biggest, in fact, based in the United States, the Joint Distribution Committee, had been founded in 1914 to help Jews during World War I, was still active, and it was really feeding European Jews at the time. And I also have very nice testimony from some Roma, actually, I should say, who were pretending to be Jews with fake IDs so they would get access to those rations in DP camps. So all of this, these resources that these Jewish organizations had at this time are the motive, really, to seek out these types of institutions and to start registering with them. But there was something else that Roma needed, and that's something that is missing here, and that is they needed more documentation. Ultimately, what they needed collectively to make claims, to say, to demand back their small houses, is to have their story told. And I want to tell you about how their story is not told. How do I tell you the story is not told? Well, I'm going to tell you about a book. This is a bit of a strange book because it's a book that was never written. Now, the book that was never written has an author. And that author's name is Gerald Reitlinger. Gerald Reitlinger was a British art historian, actually, and he wrote the first big book on the Jewish Holocaust by the name of The Final Solution, published in 1953. When German prosecutors wanted to put Nazis behind bars, that's the type of book they gave each other. It's like, basically, you need some basic information. This is, take this. He wrote some more books, one on the SS also. And he had resources to do that. What did he use? He used, among other things, an institution called the Wiener Library in London, which was the oldest Holocaust documentation archive. Basically, we know very well that he used them because he was quite rich, he was wealthy, he sat on his estate in Essex, and he had the library bring him the books, and we have files upon files of notes telling him to please return the book finally, and he never does. So we know he had support. He also had a great publisher for his later books by the name of George Weidenfeld, who was an Austrian Jew, later Lord Weidenfeld. And Lord Weidenfeld, in the late 1950s, had made some interesting publishing decisions that made him fairly flush with cash at that point. He had decided to publish Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which is a book that was prohibited in the United States, and nothing sells like a book that is prohibited, as you may know. So that decision meant that he had some funds. So he had funds. He had an author who was looking for a book, who had written about the Jewish Holocaust. And he had another author who had great connections also to Roma. So he said to Reitlinger, why don't you write a book about the Romani Holocaust? I'll publish it. This is the book that was supposed to be written. What Weidenfeld ultimately did is he set him up with this other author by the name of Hermann Langbein, who was an Austrian. He was the head of the International Auschwitz Committee, a survivor organization of those who had been in Auschwitz. And he asked him to please help him, help supply him some sources. Mr. Langbein told Gerald Reitlinger, responding to your letter, I have to repeat that currently material about the fate of the gypsies in Auschwitz is not available in a collection. At which point, Gerald Reitlinger said, well, then I am not writing a book. Because that's the secret of historians. We have other people do our work, mostly civil servants who prepare things for us in archives. And there is simply no archive here. There's nothing that he can work with. So he said, well, there's nothing for me to work with, so I'm not writing the book. This outraged Langbein, who told George Weidenfels that Reitlinger seems to have expected that I would have sources all collected and ready for him. But he wasn't just upset because he seemed, Reitlinger seemed a bit lazy. He was upset because he understood what it would have meant for Roma. What it would have meant for Roma to have a work like this. Something to show. Ultimately, what it took to change all this were institutions that would indeed collect, for example, testimonies. And it's actually one of the institutions that would do that for decades would be Jewish institutions indeed. It would be institutions like the Wiener Library, which had a visionary leader of the research branch here by the name of Eva Reichmann, who was a German Jewish emigre. The Wiener Library had started collecting testimonies in 1938 when nobody else cared about testimonies, I should say. They were really unique. She continued that project. 1957, she told a person collecting testimonies for her in Vienna that she would particularly she's particularly keen to get testimonies from gypsies. She ultimately had, for example, this testimony collected by Adolf Gussog. Because you might have wondered, how do I know anything about these random people on a list? And the answer is, I can tell you the story of 2 people on that list because, well, how many years later? 10 years later, the Wiener Library asked somebody to please collect their stories. Without that Jewish archive, without the visionary leader there, without the person interviewing there, having these connections, none of this would have happened. And I also added here something that, again, one might see as cynical. I added how much was paid for this interview. Equivalent of $150. And I'm doing this because it's a reminder. It might seem cynical, it's the opposite. I'm doing this because it reminds us that there is an infrastructure we need to do this. It's not just that Eva Reichmann was one woman who cared about Roma. It's the fact that there was an infrastructure there. Because to get this testimony to me, for me to tell you this story, it didn't just take Eva Reichmann. It took a whole archive that, would hire somebody, train somebody in Vienna to do this. Send it to the archive, have it indexed. They had 3 people just indexing testimonies in London. That archive had to survive. That's not a given at all. Most of these Holocaust archives now, it seems there's so many of them around. Most of them were nearly bankrupt in the 50s and 60s. They barely survived. And many Roman institutions don't survive even now. It actually takes a whole lot to have one place where you can go and you can find these testimonies. So this is a reminder about the infrastructure that is needed. Ultimately, the people who would do all this work had several things in common. One is, most of them were victims of Nazism themselves. Eva Reichmann was among them. All the others who were part of this chain were survivors of camps very often, or emigres. They were barely ever part of the 1968er generation, sort of a new left interested in marginal people. They were completely absent from all this work. It was survivors talking to other survivors. That's who created this information. And second, there are many who were involved in this, and most of them were born as Jews. Some of them would have not identified as Jews anymore, perhaps later in their life. But all of them needed to precisely use these Jewish networks or institutions to create that memory. And indeed, the first book, the book that Reitlinger should have written, was written in 1972. It had the name The Destiny of Europe's Gypsies, and it was published thanks to the Wiener Library that had given him the books that he never returned. So in all these respects, you can see these institutions being connected. What you can also see is still the asymmetry that I started out with when I told you about the Shoah Foundation. over time, what changed is this asymmetry is still there. Right? I told you about it in the present. It was there from the very beginning. What changed over time is the relationship between Jewish and Romani scholars and the way they can discuss all of this. Because increasingly, and this is where I'm moving us all the way to the present, increasingly, these two groups share many things. They share young people who are professionalized in a similar way, go through similar things, especially in Europe, where the majority of Roma live. Young Jewish activists, the young Romani activists go through the same formative experiences, usually unpaid internships, which is sort of very much on vogue. So places like the European Parliament, other institutions, then they move on. They write similar grants to do similar projects. So they have much more in common. They also, we can see something of the reciprocity, the back and forth between these organizations on the internet, which allows us to really see things that wouldn't have been visible otherwise. I'll just give you two examples of this. One is here. So this is the biggest Romani youth organization. It's called Ternipe. And 1 year after a terror attack against a synagogue in the German city of Halle, they put out this post, tagged the Jewish Student Union of Germany, saying, our solidarity is with the Jewish community in Halle, Germany, and Europe. We stand together opposing anti-Semitism and racism. Then, 3 months later, the Jewish students celebrating the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, when 8 lights so there's a Hanukkah or menorah that is lit, where candles are lit. They lit 1 candle per human rights cause, and one of them was solidarity with Roma and Sinti, and this is a German gender-neutral way of writing it, but the bottom line is they are returning the favor in a way. Another example of this is right after the beginning of, this is just, I think, 2021, around first wave of COVID, when one thing that was in the news is how certain groups that are marginalized are not receiving adequate health care. And it's Jewish and Romani groups coming together here to write to the president of the European Commission and European Parliament that they stand in solidarity with each other. And they end their call, the European Union of Jewish Students, this Romani organization, end their call with, join us in standing in solidarity with Roma in times of crisis. Jewish rights are Roma rights, and Roma rights are Jewish rights. So this just gives you a sense of how we come, right? Remember where we started, this narrative of not recognition? The asymmetries do not go away, but we're in a completely different space today, I would say, where there's a way these two communities are recognizing each other in direct ways that did not exist before. It's especially this generation, I would say, that does that. So, contrary to what you might have thought when I started this, I believe that I have a hopeful message about our ability to indeed start engaging with each other, with all the challenges that are there. And my own book is actually a result of this dialogue that starts here. I could have not written this book without the interactions I have had over the years of writing it with my Romani peers. So what this talk tried to do, what my book tries to do, is tell this unique story of proximate suffering and use it as a chance to rethink what our responsibilities are toward each other and each other's histories. And I think it's an opportunity to rethink what it means to have unequal alliances, when really there are no other alliances to be had. Thank you. We have a student.
Oh, I see.
Thank you for coming here and telling us your story, Professor. It was very fascinating and raised a question to me on our response to suffering today. In that, if I was thinking about the quote that the German president, the quote you presented to us, and the question of what happens if we actually invert the quote.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it not only does raise the question of the number game, which kind of goes nowhere, but it does push Jewish people to ask themselves, as members of this different group, different demographic, how do we relate to the suffering of a group whose memory was never historicized, was never recorded? And I think the question the question that would be posed to the Jewish people extends to us as well, or everybody here, everybody living today, every member of any privileged group in society. So my question is, how do we, and of course we have your book now for this story, but what about for other stories? How do we remember and identify, or how do we remember the suffering of marginalized peoples whose memory is not recorded?
I mean, my own answer is to think more about relationships. I think I am a believer in relational histories. And one thing you can see also where I start the book in a very personal way with my grandparents and the stories they told. And I did it for many reasons, and one of them is to remind myself of their struggles. Because this is the paradox. From one perspective, this indicates that Jews seem to be privileged in the way they tell their story. And the 1990s, when this was spoken, was a moment when you had a lot of conflict here between Jewish and Romani communities about who should end up on which monument. But it is the result of the fact that these Jewish communities had been struggling for decades. I mentioned that these institutions were struggling to survive. Nobody wanted to hear my grandparents' stories. The way we now tell the story of the Holocaust is a product of the 1970s and 80s. It was still very recent at this point. We needed to come to this story. This is the paradox, and this is why Jewish survivors rightly also get pretty upset when one suggests that they're missing, that there's a responsibility they have because they are just victims. What's their responsibility? They didn't choose this. Why should they have a burden? And they themselves were struggling so hard when these political prisoners who were rejecting Roma had rejected Jews too. In many states, Jews were not included. Today we think of them as the paradigmatic victims of Nazism. Right after the war, the heroic victim is whom they were looking for. The resistance fighter, that's the true heroic victim of Nazism. And they were in control of these organizations. So I also write about Belgium, for example, and even Austria. The first rounds of these laws, Jews are excluded. Then they're included as honorary political resistance fighters, even though they're persecuted due to their identity in reality. So there's a struggle there. So the paradox is it takes both. It takes that narrative to be exclusive, actually, for us to see certain things, and then it becomes our task to think about how it can become inclusive again. So for me, it is also thinking not just in these very fraught categories of privileges and victims and non-victims. It is really about trade-offs and about thinking in terms of relationships and thinking in terms of thinking in very systematic ways how real personal relationships shape how we think we know the world. Ultimately, it's a story perhaps of there are ways, often unexpected ways in which these communities come together. And one thing I try to trace in the book is just individual stories of how people learn. For example, there's this one person who's famous for going with this enormous magnet tape recorder in 1946 to Europe and interviewing survivors. He's originally from Poland and studied in Mexico, came to the US, worked at what eventually would become the Illinois Institute of Technology, goes to Europe, doesn't know anything about Roma. But the first Jew he interviews, tells him something about Roma. One tells him that they were awful, the other tells him they had it even worse than Jews. By the third interviewer telling him about this, he knows there's a story. He doesn't know what it is. He gets completely confusing and contradictory information about them, in fact. But by the fourth interview, he starts, originally it was the survivors to tell him that. By the fourth interview, he says, well, there's a known fact that Roma were persecuted. Tell me about this. So what we can see, what I think is ultimately, if you want in the details, is indeed to see the unlikely places how people learn. And what I do see in all of this is that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it's usually Jews talking to each other to learn about this. There is a rising awareness among these survivors that something happened. But to learn about it, they actually ask other Jewish survivors. And mainly because they don't know any Roma. And because they are already there in their associations, in similar circumstances. And what it would take is a Romani civil rights movement, and various other developments, basically, where these two groups would come together to eventually also create knowledge. It takes people talking to each other to create the knowledge. It cannot happen simply in a vacuum through pure will, I think.
Thank you so much for coming here to talk about the Holocaust and like the Romani stories that haven't been highlighted in like the traditional education of the Holocaust. I was wondering if you could expand on how you were able to get so many like personal stories about the Romani, because you kind of mentioned in your preface how the goal of your book is to tell stories that have never been told before. So I was wondering how you were able to get such detailed stories.
Yeah. And you say so much, I'm actually not so sure. I mean, I tried my best. I worked through lots of flawed archives. Ultimately, the one thing about an historian, right, is you wish you would get the direct access to the victim. But there is no such thing. I talked to some survivors, but ultimately, well, there's so many things that stand in your way if in the year, well, I'm not doing it now, but especially in the year 2024, it will be even harder than in the year 2014. Even then, there's so much standing in the way of getting to the experiences, certainly. You hear, they've told the story a lot of times. There's an immense distance to it. People's memories are complicated. Then there's lots of other sources. I'll give you one example. There's one of the big numbers of sources that you can, like a large stash of sources, a large file, comes from German prosecutors who so there's a famous trial that happens in 1963 to 65. It's called the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. That's named that because Frankfurt prosecutors are basically trying to get Auschwitz guards, famous Auschwitz Nazis in the Auschwitz camp, behind bars. There's a massive trial on that. And there was supposed to be a second trial then. Doesn't materialize the way it does. They had imagined it, but they interview approximately nearly 180 German Sinti. Amazing. A community that barely ever talks, and these people are talking to them. So I have a lot there, but it's deeply flawed. It's paraphrased, in legalese. If you ever had to give official protocol of something and somebody's writing it down for you, you know that's not your language. They're translating it for you into what is relevant. If you have insurance damage, and you tell them what happened, there's a version, there's what you experienced and the version that the insurance gets. Then these prosecutors sometimes force people to speak, because the law says you have to testify unless you are a family member. Then you can say of the accused. If you're not a family member of the accused, Germans can force you to do that, and they did. And who was involved? The criminal police. The criminal police was in charge of these interviews. The criminal police happened to also be the institution that had persecuted them during the Holocaust. The same criminal police still had a person called the gypsy expert on their payroll. So what does, the prosecutor goes to the local so-called gypsy expert, says, please find me the so-called gypsies who can testify against this Nazi. Then they pick them up in a police car, bring them to police headquarters, and say, and now please tell us how you've been victimized. You can imagine how flawed these testimonies are. They are as much a testimony, in fact, to the abuse by the German state as they are a testimony to what they're supposed to be talking about. So what I have are a lot of sources like this. And it's another reason why I wrote the book the way I did. It's a way of coming to terms with these limitations. It's a book both about that story and about all these limitations that we have when we want to tell the story. And I had a conversation earlier in a class where I was, and we spoke about the importance of taking history courses, which is not just to know this history, but also to understand how history is produced, which is essential. It's the history, it sounds so academic. It's our past. How we know our past. Because our past in a textbook, right, even my book, where I try to emphasize these difficulties, ultimately it becomes a story, right? Every page looks the same thanks to a good layouter. But reality doesn't look the same. The texts don't look the same that I used. What good history and good history courses do is they make us see how we construct that knowledge, which is essential precisely in an age where we talk a whole lot about how we think we don't know anymore, fake news, and generally, the insecurity of the world. I feel knowing how history has been done for a very long time, how it's been created out of these sources is essential. And this is it has some added elements, added complexities to it, but ultimately, I don't want to claim precisely that I managed to get full access there, which is why it will always also be a book about somebody trained in Jewish studies, Jewish history, writing a book 60 years after the fact with limited sources.
Hi, I'm May, and thank you for your talk. You talked a lot about the Roma and how their story is kind of like not heard. And in Trullo's Silencing the Past, he talks a lot about how like stories are silenced kind of too. And I was wondering, like, why do you think that there's only one like specific genocide that's so like talked about and not like others? Like there's the genocide of the Congo too that's not talked about at all. And I was wondering, like, how do you think genocides become silenced, and what can we do as historians to make them known rather than just like talking about the relations?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, right, I've had these experiences myself where I learn of something and I wonder, why did I not know this? I mean, this is what motivated the whole book in a way as well. And at the same time, right, so one thing one gets out of this, Tuyo, who is an anthropologist who writes about Haiti, is indeed that silencing doesn't just happen. He uses it as an active thing. They are not just silent or hidden in histories, they have been hidden. They have been silenced actively. And I think there's something to it when we want to understand the mechanisms. So as long as that means we're trying to understand the mechanisms, it's useful. Of course, it becomes harder because that language also suggests a conspiracy theory of history, right? If one spins it differently. And I think that is where it becomes unproductive, including ourselves as members of a conspiracy, because we beat ourselves up for not knowing about every atrocity. And ultimately, it's a process, I believe. And one reason this quote is useful, and the efforts of these Jewish institutions is useful, is because it's this deep ambivalence there, right? There's the Romani Holocaust would also not be known the way it is without these Jewish institutions. So we need to both think about the asymmetry, but by just saying these Jewish institutions shouldn't be doing what they're doing, we're also actually condemning it even more to silence. We're not helping anybody along. So I think there are ultimately, the Romani genocide is also ignored because the people it concerned are ignored. I mean, even when it comes to the Jewish Holocaust, there are these internal hierarchies, I would say. When the Holocaust, the U.S. Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust entered U.S. consciousness and U.S. living rooms, it was through the NBC miniseries Holocaust in 1978 with Meryl Streep and various other famous actors, and it was a German Jewish family with a so-called mixed marriage, Catholic family, and that's how it, you know, that's how viewers would be drawn into this, and that would be the paradigm that people would think of. They would have much harder time thinking about an Orthodox Polish Jew who looks so fundamentally different from them and has different beliefs. Those were the majority of victims, however, but that's not how the imagination worked. So I feel these dynamics are everywhere at play, and thinking about how they work, I think is how they, precisely thinking about how they work is the best that I feel I can do to enable the work of others ultimately, because it's where we rely on others, because I can nod when you speak about the Congo, but I would be deeply embarrassed if you forced me now to actually, educate on the genocide. So I feel we are, it's where we are communities of learners, whether as scholars or we are all students in some form, and need to think precisely about why some stories are just less interesting to us. And we won't overcome it simply, I think. It's the best. I hope it's an answer.
Thank you for coming. This might be a stupid question, but with your example of the Jewish Holocaust archive being like the only source of Roma victim testimonies, you made a point about the struggle of Roma to tell their own story without being overshadowed by like the Jewish Holocaust, which we all know about. So I'm curious about your motivation in choosing to write your book about the Roma story only as it relates to the Jewish story.
Yeah, it's my way of, I mean, I should say I'm thinking of writing another book that focuses more on Roma, but it was my way of, it was just my honest path. And it helped me think through really essential things, I felt, that I wanted to know. Wanted to know not just about the Roma, but wanted to know about the way we think about history and the suffering of others. Basically, right, it's a book where I'm trying to grapple precisely with my limitations as well, and with our limitations. There's something collective, I think, about these limitations. So it's just, I don't think, I think now I'm at a different place where I could contemplate that. I should add, I've written articles that only concern Romani history and not Jewish history. So in that sense, right, the book doesn't, it's not the only thing I've done. But at the same time, yeah, I think it is absolutely necessary to write these histories. It's the effect. There are different ways of going about all of this, I should add as well. I mean, as a historian, what I believe also, and this has to do now more with how I believe disciplines work, is that we can make moralizing claims about whom you should listen to. But it's a bit like, I think Netflix figured out at some point, people have two lists. Like there's the movies that they know they're supposed to watch, and then there's the movies they actually click that they're watching. So fine, I can tell you, you should really care about these people. Are you ever going to, like, we're all human. You can tell me morally I'm supposed to be interested in something because it's wrong not to care. But, beyond doing it in public, is one actually going to choose it? And my response as a historian is, I know that it's really, really hard to communicate Romani history. I mean, I actually should perhaps just underline how hard it is. There is no discipline. There is no journal that deals just with Romani history. There's some Romani studies, mostly linguistics and anthropology, musicology. Barely any history. There is no good history of Roma in the US. We don't know how many are in the US. A million? We don't know, really. They have been around since colonial times. We have no history of the group. There are no, I have a position and chair of a department of Jewish studies. There is no US, there is one. The Charles University in Prague has a department, has a Romani studies department. There are a few others. There's nothing in the US, no professorship, no department. So we're dealing it's a space where you really have to convince people that it matters. And my personal answer was, I need to make it matter to my colleagues, to historians, by asking big questions. So I have another article that brings together the testimonies I spoke about with digital humanities questions and privacy issues and how we deal with those. And it was published by the Journal of the Association because it addressed bigger topics. They do not publish articles just because it's right to hear these voices. So my answer has been, I need to ask, we need to bring Roma into the conversation academically in places like universities, by asking bigger questions. And this was my way of doing it. It's not the only way, and it shouldn't be the only way. And if you ask some of my European colleagues who are doing really hard work, simply excavating local stories that otherwise would never be found, they might find this annoying. Because they are doing really hard work that will not be heard the same way. But it's absolutely necessary. And this is, again, where we're a community of scholars, where we have to rely on each other, doing different types of things. And my sense was simply, what I can do best, and can do best for the field, is to do this.
There's an old saying, there's an old saying of you can't be wise until you have knowledge. So, but because you have knowledge doesn't mean you have wisdom. So I became interested in the Romani Holocaust when I was an undergraduate, which you can imagine looking at me how long ago that was. And I was interested in it because I was pursuing knowledge about what I would refer to as, and the Irish do, as an Gut Mor, the great hunger of the Irish, which was not a famine. So next time you see famine, cross it out, because they were shipping out thousands of tons of food to England while the Irish starved and died on coffin ships on their way here. Well, this is also, so I applaud you for doing your work, of course. But the reason I was drawn to the Romanis is because the Irish story had not been told much at that time. And then there was an explosion in the late 70s and the 80s of knowledge. And they even opened a museum in Connecticut, which has now been closed by Quinnipiac College, regretfully. Well, now I'm drawn to the Poles because I read about the Poles who were not Jewish and the immense number, it seems, many of them undocumented, as it is in many cases. Do you know much about that? Do you know much about who's pursuing that and why there are very few memorials to the Poles? Beyond the Polish Jews, of course, which was enormous numbers, but I read recently calculations that were stunning.
I mean, first of all, I should generally say I'm highlighting one victim group here, and it's not exclusive. Obviously, there are colleagues who work, for example, on disabled victims, an absolutely essential story that needs to be told. Again, large implications, and we don't, first group to be gassed in Nazi Germany. So the Polish story, I think, so I just want to highlight that by highlighting one story, right, the point is not never to push out other stories, but to think in ever more inclusive ways. What I know of the Polish story is mainly that. So Poland until last November had a government that very much changed how its history is told. And so in general, Poland went through multiple memory wars. Because there's a Soviet period when Polish memory of its own resistance is suppressed in favor of a larger history of, anti-fascism that includes the Soviets. Since it's a communist country to occupy under control of the Soviets. So after the Cold War, there's a massive resurgence of histories of Polish resistance, which was to a large degree conservative resistance as well. Then you get, in the late 90s and early 2000s, a series of books that challenge that new narrative. So basically it's Poland finding its own story of nationalism again, emerging from that. And then there are these stories of regular Poles murdering Jews. And that becomes a story that would tear apart the country in many respects. Basically, you're for it, you're against it. It's highly polarized discussions. For those who know history, there's the Dreyfus debate is often described in these terms. You're for, you're against, families split, young versus old. So it becomes something that is highly contentious. And then you get a new government that is voted in, when are they voted in actually? They're in power in the 2010s. And they have new memory laws actually outlawing publicly accusing Poles of being involved in these killings. So a lot of the historical debate has been around this. And now there's a new government, and I don't know how they're going to deal with this. This includes, by the way, people who are worried about writing about regular Poles being involved in the murder of Roma, who are in some cases shot by regular police in Poland. So I feel the story of so my knowledge is somewhere around 3 million Poles are murdered in the war, right? But it comes out of a history where they would say 6, which is also true. But the other 3 are Jews who are sometimes murdered. They're murdered by Germans in extermination camps, but there are stories of Polish involvement, which complicate it, but which in public memory politics, if we're talking about that, has complicated all of this and politicized also the memory of these Poles. So I think what you're pointing is something really fascinating. What if one moves beyond these debates that certainly in the historical profession have been, it's both in Poland and in the historical profession, have really been dominating, I would say. So I hope that's the beginning. I think it's really a beginning of an answer, and one could speak in much more length about Polish battles for recognition of what happened in Poland.
All right, please give a warm round of applause for Dr. Gaskowitz. And don't forget to join us down the hall.